The unfair matches of the Roman Colosseum, the morning fog drifting over ancient Rome. The Colosseum stood like a stone beast slowly waking. Its shadow cut across the paved streets as vendors dragged carts loaded with olives, cheese, and dubious sausages toward the swelling crowd. But we are not here for the shouting, or the thunder of hooves, or even the clash of bronze. No, this is the boring history, the hidden gears, the paperwork behind the gladiator fights, you see. For every lion versus man spectacle or breathless recreation of a naval skirmish flooded with astonishing engineering, there was an entire team of administrative minds quietly matching opponents, and quite often getting it very, very wrong. Beneath the Colosseum, not just tunnels but whole corridors were filled with oil lamps, cages, and clerks. Yes, clerks, in pale linen tunics, sipping watered wine and scratching away at wax tablets. They would chart the strengths, weaknesses, and status of each gladiator, their system, oddly disorganized for a civilization that engineered aqueducts. While some scribes tried to balance fights, others, due to laziness, corruption, or simply boredom, scheduled what historians now consider the most lopsided battles in Colosseum history. Imagine this: a veteran Murmillo, trained for 12 years, armed with a gladius and scutum, thrown into a match against a condemned thief handed a dull trident and a poorly knotted net. The crowd didn't mind, of course, but the thief certainly did. Why were these unfair matchups so frequent? One reason was the peculiar gladiator rating system. Gladiators were not simply ranked by skill, but also by crowd appeal. This meant that a fighter known for dramatic screams, even if terrible with a blade, could be promoted in the fight order. Likewise, a competent but dull opponent might find himself sent against a lion instead of another man. Entertainment over equity. Always another factor was the sine missione decree, fights with no mercy allowed. These were rare but occasionally enforced during festivals or by specific emperors craving blood. But more interestingly, most of the mismatches weren't cruel by design. They were bureaucratic accidents. The ludus or training schools were required to send updates on their fighters' injuries, stamina, morale levels. Details were logged and sent to the Colosseum staff weekly. Except when they weren't, and often they weren't. Sometimes, a scribe in Capua would neglect to mention that one of their best fighters had taken a spear to the thigh and could barely stand. That fighter might then be scheduled against a fresh opponent from Gaul, who, after hearing the announcement, wondered why he was facing someone who could barely lift a shield. Moreover, the Colosseum's logistics team was underpaid and undertrained. When tasked with organizing 20 bouts in one day, featuring lions, chariots, elephants, and dozens of fighters from across the empire, mistakes were inevitable. One legendary mismatch, noted by Cassius Dio, involved a blindfolded charioteer being set loose in the arena for novelty. He veered into a pile of untrained volunteers posing as enemy soldiers. The crowd applauded. The organizers shrugged. Yet, for all the blood and chaos above ground, the Colosseum's lower chambers were often described by historians as orderly to a fault. Labyrinthine hallways stored lists, names, feeding logs for animals, and delivery receipts for helmets. In one recently unearthed storage room, archaeologists found a rusted shelf containing over 600 bronze tags, each with a fighter's name and injury status. Of course, no one really read them in time. One wonders how the gladiators themselves felt about all this. Were they aware that a tired official's nap could seal their fate? Did they laugh quietly when they saw their opponent, knowing the match was absurd before the first blow? Some, like the famed gladiator Spiculus, were granted better treatment by favor of the emperor, but most simply trained, ate lentils, prayed to Fortuna, and hoped the day's clerk was having a good morning. At its peak, the Colosseum employed nearly 1,000 people behind the scenes. Only a fraction of them ever saw the sand. The rest, cooks, armor polishers, record keepers, stretcher bearers, kept the engine of spectacle running. And yet, amidst this grand machine, one can't help but wonder how many unfair matches were caused not by malice, but simply by someone misreading a name. Down in the belly of Rome, not far from the Colosseum's looming arches, sat a day the Ludus Magnus, the largest gladiator school in the empire. It was less a place of inspiration and more a factory of human endurance. Here, men were not trained to win battles, but to prolong death in the most graceful, audience-pleasing way possible, but to understand how unfair matches in the arena were not just tolerated but orchestrated. You have to start in these sand-swept courtyards. Each gladiator school had its own rhythm. Wake before dawn, oil your body, eat a breakfast of barley, porridge and beans, then begin drills that focus not on strength, but on spectacle. Trainers, often ex-gladiators themselves, barked out slow, deliberate movements meant to be seen from the upper tiers of the Colosseum. A flourish of a shield, a dramatic stagger after a false blow, and a long, drawn-out collapse. It was all part of the choreography. But behind the scenes, every school was required to keep a registry of its fighters. This included not just names, but fighting styles. There were dozens beyond the commonly known murmillo or riti areas. Physical conditions, recent match results, behavioral notes, and status updates like healing from fractured fibula or notably timid. These registers were then sent to Rome, hand-delivered by weary couriers riding across provinces. And here is where the trouble began. You might think the Roman Empire would have a standardized form, a tidy scroll with checkboxes and neat rows. Not so. Each lanista, the gladiator school's overseer, wrote their records differently. Some were obsessively detailed, including notes like hates onions or sleeps with left eye open. Others scribbled vague statements, still alive, stronger, once in Rome. The overburdened Colosseum administrators had to interpret these notes, often dictated in regional dialects, and file them into the central registry. Inevitably, names blurred. Was Marcus of the East the same as Marcos from Asia Minor? Was Flavius a title, or his actual name? And when two fighters were accidentally assigned the same identifier, Tigranes the Black, one might end up in the arena while the other was recovering in a sick bed. This happened more than once. Take the case of a Gaulish fighter known in records as Crix. He was supposed to be matched against a young, untested recruit from Hispania, but due to a scribal misreading, Crix was swapped with a Syrian charioteer named Circe, who had no melee training whatsoever. The result was disastrous, if not somewhat comedic. Circe entered the arena still wearing a half-saddle, holding a small whip, confused and blinking at the glaring sun. What followed was not so much a fight as an apologetic evasion. Crix, meanwhile, stayed in the barracks, nursing a bruised shoulder and wondering why his name hadn't been called. But even when records were accurate, there was still the issue of preference. Certain gladiators became crowd favorites whether because of looks, luck, or the elaborate way they died or refused to. Promoters, eager to keep the audience entertained, sometimes delayed these fighters' appearances until a bigger festival. That meant less experienced or unpopular fighters had to fill their slot on short notice. Then there was the emperor's influence. The emperor, whoever happened to be in charge at the time, had the authority to request certain types of matches. Nero famously enjoyed theatrical reenactments. Commodus wanted exotic animals and used to enter the arena himself, armed with a javelin and a dozen guards hidden in the crowd. If a particular mood struck, gladiators would be pulled from the roster, swapped around, or replaced altogether. So even a well-matched fight could be sabotaged by an imperial whim. Moreover, the games weren't just about combat. There were mock naval battles, mythological reenactments, and punishment scenes in which condemned criminals were forced to play the role of a doomed character from legend. One man was once made to dress as Icarus and flung from a tall platform with wax wings. He did not fly. These events required rehearsals, props, and for the more elaborate executions, animal coordination. Once, lions were supposed to devour a man playing Actaeon, who had offended the gods by bathing in sacred waters. But the lions, poorly fed and deeply disinterested, lay down beside him instead. The man was dragged away, alive and humiliated, back in the Colosseum offices. Meanwhile, workers were busy calculating crowd sizes and food orders. On days when seating overflowed and extra spectators had to stand, the fights were often shortened, or lesser-trained fighters were brought in as filler. These were sometimes slaves bought solely for this purpose, men with no training, no armor, and no real chance. The organizers justified these matches as crowd warmers. The audience usually didn't know or didn't care. But perhaps the most fascinating cause of unfair matchups was bribery. A lanista could, in theory, bribe an official to ensure their most promising fighter wasn't scheduled against a formidable opponent too soon. In some cases, they paid to delay matches, giving their men extra recovery time. Others paid to have rivals scheduled prematurely before they had healed from previous injuries. This created a shadow economy of match manipulation. Certain fighters, dubbed the Emperor's Luck, were suspected of receiving state-sponsored protections. Others died without even being entered into the official logs, disappearing entirely from history except for the faded graffiti on a nearby wall. A scrawled message found on a Colosseum column reads, "Tetricus fought on empty stomach. Died for no one's amusement." The cruel irony. Tetricus was likely meant to fight later that day, but due to a last-minute name swap, he was pushed into a morning match. The error was never corrected. Despite it all, the machine rolled on. The games continued, the crowds roared, and the scribes kept scribbling. The unfair matches were part and parcel of the spectacle, both tolerated and ignored, perhaps even necessary to keep the illusion of endless excitement alive. But one can't help but wonder if so many fighters were misfiled, misread, or mismatched, how many heroic stories were simply lost between two wax tablets. As the years wore on, the sand of the Colosseum bore more than blood. It bore the slow burden of routine. The shouts of the crowd softened over time, not because they grew gentler, but because repetition dulled even violence. For centuries, unfair matches persisted not as aberrations, but as standard operations, built into the very logistics of empire. By the 3rd century AD, the empire was shifting. Funds were tightening. Fewer slaves were entering the system. Even the best lanista found it harder to procure healthy recruits. Gladiator schools struggled with food shortages, outbreaks of illness, and a growing disinterest from younger Romans, who now preferred horse races or theater. With that decline came further mismatches. Emperors, facing financial stress, began reducing payouts to fighters and schools. Armor was recycled, weapons dulled, and training hours cut. The consequence? Even more unbalanced contests, young, unprepared slaves facing old, injured veterans with little oversight or concern. One document discovered near the ruins of the Ludus Gallicus school outlines a sobering list. 3 gladiators scheduled to fight had been listed as deceased for over a month, yet their names remained in rotation. It seems the registrar simply hadn't updated his scroll, or perhaps no one had bothered to ask. The clerks, too, changed. Gone were the days of seasoned scribes trained in the subtleties of match balancing. Now, overworked civil servants with no background in combat were rotated in from other departments. One infamous record from the late 3rd century shows that a gladiator labeled as Retiarius, a Netan trident fighter, was actually a Bestiarius, someone trained only to fight animals. No one caught the error until it was far too late. And then, like a light dimming in fog, the games began to fade. The last officially recorded gladiator match in Rome occurred in the year 400 for AD. According to accounts, a Christian monk named Telemachus entered the arena and tried to stop the bloodshed. Whether he was stoned by the crowd or executed by the guards remains unclear. What matters is that shortly afterward, Emperor Honorius issued a decree halting gladiatorial combat. It wasn't morality that finally ended the unfair matches. It was administration. Gladiator schools were shuttered not in outrage, but in silence. Weapons were put away, armor melted down, and dusty registries burned or stored in forgotten chambers. The Colosseum, once a thunderous heart of spectacle, fell quiet. Over time, it hosted occasional animal hunts and theatrical displays, but never again the roar of uneven steel against unready flesh. Perhaps that's the strangest part. A tradition so brutal, yet so meticulously organized behind the scenes, simply ended with a stroke of a pen and a declining line in the budget. And in the echoes of that silence, one has to wonder how many of history's great spectacles ended, not with fanfare, but with misfiled scrolls and exhausted clerks finally getting a chance to rest. Story 2, a day in the life of a Byzantine tax collector. The Byzantine Empire often remembered for its grand churches and intricate diplomacy, also functioned quietly and persistently on the shoulders of its tax collectors. While emperors schemed from golden thrones and generals rode across Anatolia, a lesser-known army wandered muddy paths and bustling alleys with nothing more than ink-stained fingers, a wax-sealed bag of scrolls, and a firm pair of shoes. You might imagine a Byzantine tax collector marching into a village, papers fluttering, demanding coins from trembling peasants. But the reality was more tedious and oddly human. Take a man like Theodoros of Nicomedia. He was neither particularly fearsome nor particularly clever. What he was, however, was punctual. His daily uniform consisted of a dark wool tunic, worn, boots stuffed with straw to patch a hole, and a wide leather belt that held his most important tool, not a sword, but a scroll case. Within were columns of scribbled names, land measurements, crop estimates, and occasionally a crude doodle drawn during especially long waits outside locked doors. Each morning, Theodoros would rise before first light, boiling his morning porridge, with salted olives on the side. A brass cup of wine watered down, of course, helped ease the cold in his fingers. Then came the slow preparation, rolling scrolls, dipping ink, checking his tallies from the day before. The empire's taxation system was unforgiving, but its recording practices were meticulous. By the time the sun scraped the rooftops of the village, Theodoros would be on the road. His goal? Collect land and hearth taxes from a list of households that were, by this point in the month, either unusually quiet or full of creative excuses. Taxes in Byzantium came in many forms. There were capitations, taxes on individuals simply for existing land, taxes based on how much farmland one owned, and even profession taxes levied on cobblers, bakers, or fishermen. Each required a different entry on Theodoros's ledger, often cross-referenced with earlier census scrolls that hadn't been updated in years. The actual collecting of taxes was a peculiar dance. One couldn't simply demand coins. For one, most villagers didn't use coins often. Payments might come in sacks of barley, jars of pickled onions, or bolts of scratchy wool. And so, Theodoros would have to assess the value of goods based on market rates from Constantinople that were already weeks out of date by the time the parchment reached his region. If a widow insisted her goat had died in the recent frost and she couldn't pay, Theodoros had two choices: issue a fine, which required extra paperwork, or come back later, which meant rewalking the same muddy path in today's time. Closing parenthesis. Sometimes he chose the paperwork. Sometimes he just sighed. Every door knock came with a calculation. Was the household known for underreporting their livestock? Did the children speak Latin or Greek? And could he speak enough of either to make himself understood? Would the tax be settled now? Or would he be invited in, offered a slice of bread, and gently lied to? Theodoros kept notes on these interactions in a small codex tucked into his belt. House of Leontios pretends not to speak Greek, understands fine when wine is mentioned. Maria the flax weaver husband said to be away since last planting season. Likely untrue. Lunch, when it came, was often eaten on the roadside. He'd sit beneath an olive tree or on the low stone wall near the communal well, dipping crusts of bread into fig jam. Sometimes, if he was near the coast, he'd buy a strip of salted fish from a passing vendor, and all the while, he tallied receipts on thin scraps of parchment, careful not to let the ink smudge. Each collector also carried a set of copper seal stamps, which were pressed into warm wax blobs to signify receipt. A successful tax exchange might end with the official stamp of the empire pressed into a cracked piece of wax on the villager's doorframe or barn gate. These tokens were more than decoration. Should a dispute arise later, and disputes always did, the stamped wax served as proof that a debt had been paid or promised. By late afternoon, Theodoros's satchel would be heavier now, containing coins, cloth, dried lentils, and once, memorably, a chicken he had to carry by its feet all the way back to the village office. And yet, for all the monotony, there was something oddly ritualistic in the process. The same doors, the same hesitant greetings, the same unspoken agreement that the tax must be paid, not necessarily now, and not necessarily in cash, but paid nonetheless. Back at the village administrative room, Theodoros would unroll his scrolls. One last time, by candlelight, he recorded who paid what, who owed more, and who had attempted badly to pass off hollowed gourds as a form of currency. One particularly bold farmer had offered goat perfume as tax in kind. It was just rainwater in a wine bottle. As the wax cooled and the lamp oil burned low, Theodoros sighed, logged the last tally, and prepared for another round tomorrow. But he could not shake the creeping realization. What if some households had been counted twice? What if old census scrolls hadn't been updated? And more importantly, what if the empire didn't really know who owed what anymore? If you had walked into the regional office in Nicomedia sometime around 912 AD, you'd be greeted not by a grand chamber of gold and order, but by a room that smelled faintly of tallow, sweat, and ink. The shelves sagged under scrolls bound in leather-stripped records so old that half of them referenced village names long since abandoned or renamed. And yet, these were the very records that Theodoros and his fellow collectors relied upon to issue taxes. The Byzantine Empire prided itself on continuity, and part of that meant maintaining the same administrative structures even as the world changed around them. Taxes were still being calculated using base data gathered generations earlier when fields had been more fertile, rivers less unpredictable, and families larger. To alter the records would require imperial permission, which meant a request had to be sent to Constantinople and wait. So the system simply layered new data atop the old. If a farmer's son took over the family land, the name might be updated if someone remembered. If a flood swallowed a hamlet whole, the land was still assessed as productive. At least on paper, Theodoros knew the census scrolls were flawed. He had walked miles to visit the goat herder's house near the fig orchard, only to find a patch of weeds and some broken stones. But the name remained on the rolls, and if he failed to collect from that property, it would reflect poorly on his tally. So what did he do? He paid it himself. Yes, that was not uncommon. Byzantine tax collectors were not only responsible for collecting taxes, they were often held accountable if expected revenue was not met. If a village had been overestimated in terms of crop yield, or if a household had emigrated or perished in a plague wave, it didn't matter. The empire expected the quota. Many collectors responded to this by applying more pressure on those who remained. If 5 households disappeared, the remaining 10 were asked to contribute a little more. Technically, this was illegal, but practically, it was expected. Others, like Theodoros, kept a quiet ledger of fill-ins. He used his modest salary and set aside a portion each month to make up the difference. When a widow couldn't pay or when an entire hillside farm turned out to be barren, the empire, for its part, was not entirely blind to these issues. Periodically, it dispatched imperial inspectors known as epoptai or logothetes, grim-faced men in finer cloaks, who came armed with their own scrolls and their own agendas. Their job, audit the regional records, verify that taxes matched population figures and land maps. These visits caused a flurry of activity. Theodoros would stay up late, burning extra candles, straightening records, and in some cases, rewriting entries to make them more legible or more believable. He wasn't corrupt in the sense of embezzlement, but he understood that numbers needed to align, whether they were true or not. One year, a particularly sharp-eyed inspector pointed out that Theodoros had collected wool as a form of payment, despite a decree the year before forbidding non-metal contributions. Theodoros had to explain that the village in question hadn't seen solid coinage in over a decade, and that accepting wool had allowed the empire to receive something rather than nothing. The inspector was unmoved, but coinage was a genuine problem. Currency shortages plagued the Byzantine provinces. Gold solidi were increasingly hoarded, and the empire's copper coinage phallus was badly debased. This led to market confusion. What was a chicken worth to phallus 3? What about a bolt of coarse linen or a clay amphora? Prices varied wildly from village to village, and no standard exchange rate could be enforced. So Theodoros became, by necessity, an amateur economist. He jotted down the going rates for goods each week, scribbling conversions in the margins of his ledgers. 1 jug olive oil equals 3 loaves barley bread equals half iron sickle equals 5 nights tax delay. When collectors met in the evenings over thin soup and shared crusts, they swapped stories not of politics or religion, but of valuation strategies. Do you accept sheep bones as collateral? One asked once, only if it still had meat on it. Another replied. As Byzantine society became more complex, the gap between peasant life and imperial expectations widened. Taxes were fixed, but lives were fluid. Families merged, lands divided. Daughters married out, and sons took up trades elsewhere. The records, however, did not keep pace. Theodoros often found himself collecting from someone not on his list, while failing to find those who were, and yet, somehow, he was expected to reconcile it all. He once sat for 3 days with an elder, who insisted he had paid in full, only to realize that the man had confused this year's scroll with one from 20 years prior. The scrolls had aged better than the memories, and so, the collectors made choices. To forgive a tax meant trouble. With Constantinople, to enforce it meant harming people he saw every day. To report the truth meant bureaucratic reprimand. To lie, softly and strategically, kept things running. This delicate balance became a way of life, an unspoken code among collectors. Keep the peace, meet the quotas, don't attract attention. But with every step he took, every knock on every door, Theodoros couldn't help but feel the weight of a simple question. How long could a system function on numbers no one fully believed? Evening in the Byzantine countryside was a quiet thing, no great fanfare, no burst of celebration. The sun faded behind the hills with a slow yawn, casting amber shadows over fields that might have once been prosperous, or might always have been rocky and hard to till. Theodoros of Nicomedia would walk the last of his route as smoke curled from chimneys, and families boiled cabbage, lentils, or in rare cases, leftover goat stew. In these twilight hours, the village felt both eternal and fragile. Taxes had been collected here since before Rome became Byzantium, and they would continue long after Theodoros and his worn boots disappeared from the scrolls. And yet, this profession, the tax collector's trade, was changing. The Byzantine tax system, once the envy of the Mediterranean for its complexity and resilience, was beginning to show signs of strain. The rural aristocracy had grown bolder, seizing land, consolidating estates, and in many cases, negotiating exemptions with imperial officials. That meant fewer rich households to tax, and more burden falling on commoners. Worse still, the growing power of the Orthodox Church meant entire tracts of land were considered sacred, and therefore untaxable. Theodoros once joked, darkly, that a donkey could become holy if its stable was near a chapel. Faced with dwindling sources, collectors were pressured to expand their reach. Villages that had been left alone due to poor soil or remoteness were now added back to the rolls. Old names reappeared, forgotten pots were cleared, and Theodoros found himself knocking on doors that hadn't been taxed in a generation. The people did not always welcome him. He was spat on once, though the old woman apologized after she'd mistaken him for a debt collector. Another time, a boy pelted him with olives, but more often, he was met with weariness. A long pause before the door opened. A sigh, a gesture toward a half-empty pantry. Take what you must, they'd say, leave the rest. And what Theodoros took, he did not keep. He wasn't a rich man, nor particularly ambitious, but he kept the empire's machine oiled in his own quiet way. One wax stamp at a time, or still. He knew the system couldn't last. The signs were all. Their scrolls were updated less often. Payments were delayed more frequently. New clerks arrived in silk shoes and left after 2 weeks, overwhelmed by mud and confusion. Even the imperial audits had grown infrequent. Inspectors sent only every 5 or 10 years, and even then, more interested in dinner than diligence. In Constantinople, emperors waged political battles, signed treaties with distant kins, and debated theological nuance over fish dinners. But here, in Nicomedia, and countless towns like it, the glue of empire was made of wax, ink, and a tax collector's patience. The final records we have of Theodoros are sparse. One fragment, likely from a colleague's scroll, notes that he left for the hills near Nicomedia, possibly to resurvey. No follow-up record ever appears. He did not die in battle, nor was he martyred or celebrated. He simply stopped being written about in the centuries that followed. The profession of tax collector shifted. Local elites began collecting dues. Village elders, bribed or pressured, took over the roles. Central oversight declined. The once intricate web of imperial taxation loosened into a patchwork of regional arrangements. And so, like the figures he once recorded on fading parchment, Theodoros vanished into the margins of history, not with a rebellion or a final tax decree, but perhaps with one last knock on a farmhouse door, a shrug at a ledger, and the realization that even empires built on numbers eventually forget the men who wrote them. So, now, centuries later, in a world where taxes are filed online and balances are digital, we remember a time when they were carried in a waxed scroll case, alongside dried figs and a spare quill. And we ask ourselves, what would Theodoros make of a world where no one has to walk for miles to collect what the state is owed? Story 3. Why medieval monks spent so much time copying books. Long before printing presses clattered in dusty workshops, before bookstores and PDFs and e-readers, the only way to produce a book was by hand, one painstaking letter at a time. And in medieval Europe, the duty of preserving knowledge sacred, strange, and occasionally miscopied fell largely to a peculiar group. Monks. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't fast, but it was strangely peaceful. Let us step quietly into a 12th century Benedictine monastery, perhaps somewhere in northern France, where mist clings to the moss-covered stones and a rooster crows only once hesitantly, as if not wanting to disturb the rules of silence within these thick walls. As the first hints of dawn slip through the narrow, arched windows, a man named Brother Anselm is already awake. He has not spoken a word since yesterday evening, not because he has nothing to say, but because the rule of Saint Benedict recommends silence outside of necessity. And in a scriptorium, silence is sacred. The scriptorium is not much to look at, just a long, drafty room lined with wooden desks and small stools. The windows are thin slits, not for decoration, but for security and insulation. The cold here settles in your knees and fingers, which is not ideal for delicate handwriting. But still, the monks endure it, because copying texts is more than labor, it is devotion. Brother Anselm lights a beeswax candle and sits at his station. On his desk rests a piece of stretched parchment vellum, made from sheep or calf skin. It's pale, soft, and costly. Next to it sits a pot of iron gall ink and a set of pens, quills sharpened from goose feathers, trimmed to different angles depending on the thickness of line needed. He will spend the next 10 to 12 hours copying a theological treatise written 100 years earlier, which itself was copied from a text first drafted in Latin around the time of Charlemagne. He does not question the words. He may not even fully understand them. His task is not to analyze but to preserve. The work is slow. He must first rule the page with faint red lines to ensure the letters sit in orderly rows. There are no shortcuts. Each letter must be spaced just so. Each paragraph begins with a flourish, a larger, decorated initial that may include gold leaf or tiny blue dragons biting their own tails. Occasionally, Anselm pauses not from fatigue, but to correct himself. A dropped letter, a smudged comma. Corrections are allowed, but they must be made carefully, with a knife to scrape the surface clean. Then a gentle touch to reink the spot. The wrong blotch could ruin an entire sheet, and vellum is expensive. A full book might take the skins of dozens of animals. And what does Anselm copy? Often scripture. Yes, but also medical texts, grammar treatises, herbals, chronicles of kings, or strange bestiaries filled with imaginary animals and moral metaphors. Many of these texts were preserved through sheer inertia. No one was sure if they were still useful. But once written down, they remained in circulation. The process is mentally consuming but oddly meditative. There are no distractions, no conversations, no background music, just the scratch of quill on skin, the occasional shifting of robes, and the steady tick of time passing unnoticed. Lunch will be simple bread, a bit of cheese, perhaps a boiled turnip. Then it's back to the scriptorium until dusk. Anselm isn't alone. Other monks are at work, each at their own desk, heads bowed. One man copies an index, Another translates Greek into Latin. A third paints an illumination of brilliant, jewel-toned image that will accompany a psalm. There is little supervision. Discipline is self-imposed. Each monk believes this work contributes to the divine order. The beauty of a well-formed letter is seen as a kind of prayer. But one must wonder, why dedicate years of one's life to writing what already exists? Why not do something more impactful? The answer lies in the monastic worldview. To copy a sacred text was to stabilize truth in a world of change. To record history was to freeze it in place, like amber, and to do so silently, humbly, without ever expecting fame or recognition. This was considered the purest form of intellectual labor. Errors did occur. Sometimes they were accidental. Sometimes they were added on purpose. A side note, a political jab, a doodle of a rabbit jousting with a snail. Scholars centuries later would puzzle over such drawings. Were they satire, boredom, spiritual metaphor? No one quite knows. The marginalia, those notes scribbled in the edges of the page, are the only personal voice these silent monks left behind. And even those they never signed. So tomorrow, Anselm will return to his desk, dip his pen, and begin again. Not because he must, but because he believes in the preservation of words no matter how slowly they move. But as the wind howls gently through the narrow windows, it is fair to ask, did any of them ever wonder if the books they so lovingly copied would ever be read? By the 13th century, monasteries across Europe had become islands of literacy in a largely illiterate sea. Long before universities bustled with students, before publishers bound volumes with glue and linen, the knowledge of the Western world relied on a slow-moving network of monks, ink, and parchment. Their efforts didn't just preserve the words, they preserved the rhythm of learning. But copying books wasn't just about creating neat replicas. It was about translating, reorganizing, reinterpreting, and yes, sometimes misinterpreting complex ideas that had passed through countless hands already. What began as an Aristotelian concept in Greek might appear in a monastery in Kent, 2 centuries later, rewritten in Latin, with a few errors, and some odd commentary added in the margin. And this is where the work of monks becomes less about mechanical duplication and more about human storytelling. Let's return to our friend Brother Anselm. He has been copying the same volume of theological commentary for nearly a month now, every day. He adds a few more lines, his script smooth but not flawless. The candle wax has stained the corners of his desk. His fingers are cracked from the cold, his back permanently bent in a posture of submission not to a master, but to the work itself. Alongside the main text, Anselm has been adding something else, marginalia. Small notes, gently scratched into the edge of the page in tiny, precise letters. Some are clarifications. Others are reminders, cross-references to earlier chapters, biblical citations, even the occasional question mark when the logic of the text falters. But now and then, something unexpected appears. A miniature drawing of a dog with a monk's face, a tiny fish wearing a crown, a note that simply reads, "The soup today had too much salt." These flourishes weren't uncommon. While silence was sacred in the monastery, the margins offered a quiet rebellion, a space for expression, humor, doubt, even boredom. Some monks grew bolder. One manuscript from the Abbey of Bury St. Edmunds contains a doodle of a knight in full armor, battling a giant snail. Another shows a bishop giving a sermon to a group of indifferent cats. We don't know exactly why. Were these inside jokes, allegories, a cry for entertainment, a late-night indulgence after too many hours copying unending lines of Leviticus? Whatever the case, the margins became a record of the minds behind the manuscripts, glimpses of the personalities otherwise erased by monastic humility. The transmission of knowledge was anything but perfect. Mistakes crept in with alarming regularity. A skipped line, a repeated phrase, a misunderstood word. And these errors compounded over time. That copying from a flawed text meant multiplying its flaws. Monks often worked in teams, one reading aloud, others writing, but poor acoustics, thick accents, and the occasional sneeze meant that even this system had gaps still. Some scribes took pride in their accuracy. They would sign their work with humble pleas. "Whoever reads this, pray for the scribe who labored. I wrote this without wine, Perhaps that was a mistake. These weren't authors in the modern sense. Their goal wasn't originality, but preservation. Yet, ironically, their choices shaped the future of Western knowledge. The texts they chose to copy were the ones that survived. Others' works of pagan philosophy, early science, women's poetry often disappeared simply because no monk decided to preserve them. That was the quiet power of the scriptorium. With no overt censorship, but limited time and resources, the scribes of Europe slowly narrowed the range of what survived. And not out of cruelty but practicality. A single book could take 6 months to copy. Illuminated manuscripts richly decorated with gold and color might take years. The labor was heavy, the materials expensive. One codex could cost as much as a small vineyard. And so, every page copied was a vote for the past. A silent decision. This text matters enough to endure. Even the logistics were mind-numbing. The parchment had to be cut, folded, and pricked with a stylus to make even lines. Ink was brewed from crushed oak galls, mixed with iron salts and vinegar. The quills had to be sharpened daily. Mistakes had to be scraped clean with a knife, then re-smoothed with pumice. And then there was the binding, the storage, the eventual repair when mice or damp invaded the library. Some monasteries developed impressive catalog systems. Others kept piles of books, locked in chained libraries secured to desks with iron links. To prevent theft, not that there were many readers outside the walls, but slowly, the world outside was changing. By the late 1200s, urban schools and cathedral scriptoria were beginning to take over. Lay scribes, non-monks, began copying for profit. The work became faster, more commercial. Errors increased, but availability grew. Brother Anselm, if he lived to see it, might have wondered what would happen to the craft. Would books still be sacred if anyone could make them? And even more quietly, he might have asked, if the margins were gone, would the monks ever be remembered at all? By the time the 15th century rolled around, something strange had begun to happen in the halls of Europe's monasteries. Scriptoriums were no longer bustling with the scratch of quills. The long benches stood half empty. Candles still flickered. Parchment still curled in the cold morning air, but fewer monks arrived to sharpen their pens. A German goldsmith named Johannes Gutenberg had introduced a revolutionary technology in Mainz, the printing press. At first, monks didn't pay much attention. After all, the printed books were crude, thick black letters, uneven ink, no illuminated initials or decorative flourishes. They seemed unworthy of the reverent silence that had surrounded books for centuries. But soon, presses multiplied. Printed books could be copied in hours rather than months. They were cheaper, faster, and shockingly legible. By the 1470s, presses existed in dozens of European cities. Books once found only in the libraries of abbots and kings now appeared in merchant homes, in schools, even on street carts. For men like Brother Anselm, who had spent entire decades perfecting the loop of an A or the tail of a Q, this change was both wondrous and quietly devastating. The monasteries did not end their copying immediately. In some places, monks continued to transcribe texts by hand well into the 16th century. Illuminated manuscripts were still produced for wealthy patrons, more as art than utility. But the age of the monastic scribe was fading. Page by page, Anselm, or someone very much like him, likely finished his final manuscript with little ceremony. He placed the last period with care, blew gently to dry the ink, and rolled up the parchment with the same reverence he'd shown for 40 years. There would be no applause, no farewell feast, just another candle blown out and a scroll placed on a shelf already full of books few would ever read. But the legacy of the scribes lived on in the books themselves. Thanks to their quiet efforts, much of the ancient world's knowledge survived. Aristotle, Galen, Boethius, Augustine, these names endured not because their words were immortal, but because monks like Anselm believed they were worth copying. Even pagan authors were preserved, as long as their works could be reconciled with Christian doctrine or at least quietly tolerated. Ironically, many printed editions of early books were based directly on these monastic copies. The errors, quirks, and abbreviations of the scribes became part of the record, and the doodles, Some even made it into early print runs reproduced with ink blocks, as if they, too, had something important to say. Centuries later, modern scholars would pore over these manuscripts with magnifying glasses and digital scanners. They'd write dissertations on marginalia, hold conferences about ink composition, and debate whether a particular Latin line was miscopied or misread. But the monks had never asked to be remembered. Their lives were shaped not by ambition, but by duty. To them, the book was not a product, but a prayer, and as the printing press transformed the world, the monks quietly stepped aside, their last contributions shelved next to the very tools that replaced them. Now, in silent archives and dim cathedral libraries, you can still find their work, in the faded lines of ink, in the careful spacing between letters. In the odd rabbit jousting a snail you'll see them, not as authors, but as caretakers of the written word, not as innovators, but as preservers. And in that silence between pages, you might ask, in a world flooded with printed words, do we still value the ones that were written slowly by hand in cold stone rooms by candlelight? Story 4. The Persian water clock keepers and their sleepy routine. In the bustling heart of medieval Persia, amidst the domed palaces and caravanserai that smelled of saffron and rosewater, there was once a man whose job, while essential to the empire, was often dismissed as painfully dull. He was a mirabiab, a water clock keeper. You might expect that timekeeping in the Islamic Golden Age was the glamorous work of astronomers or philosophers, and yes, they did their share. But when it came to the daily regulation of city life, market hours, mosque calls, tax deadlines, and even when to shut the public bathhouse, those decisions often rested on the shoulders of a quiet man hunched over a bronze bowl in a dim room, listening to dripping water. This is the story of men like Harun, a fictional but historically representative timekeeper in the court of the Buyid dynasty, sometime around the 10th century in the city of Shiraz. His job, to measure time by means of clepsydra's water clocks that counted minutes and hours through the simple, gentle action of droplets falling into a measured vessel. The water clock was not a new invention. The ancient Egyptians and Greeks had used them, and by Harun's time, Persians had refined them into complex, calibrated machines. But at its core, the concept was soothingly simple: a vessel with a hole, allowing water to escape or fill at a steady rate. Time passed with every drop. Each morning before sunrise, Harun would wake and dress in simple linen. He carried no scrolls, no sword, just a small brass ladle and a thin reed pen for marking time. His workshop, tucked behind the madrasa, was a low-ceilinged room of tile and brick, a small window let in blue morning light, and the occasional mewling cat. Inside, a set of bronze bowls sat in a shallow stone basin filled with water. The key to his timekeeping was calibration. The bowl, punctured with a pin-sized hole, floated on the water's surface. Slowly, it filled, and when it sank precisely, at a known interval, Harun would remove it, empty it, and start the process again. Some clocks had float indicators. Others relied on vessels slowly filling marked columns. The bowls were burnished smooth by years of handling. One, inscribed with Quranic verses around its rim, had been used by Harun's teacher and his teacher before him. Tools passed down through quiet generations. Once the first bowl sank, Harun would strike a small bell or tap a wooden mallet, signaling to the muezzin that the hour for morning prayer approached. Later, another sinking bowl might cue the bazaar to open or the public granary to be unlocked. There were no dramatic countdowns, no ticking gears, just rhythm, drip by drip. To some, this life seemed sleepy, uneventful, but it demanded immense concentration. A missed interval could cause a chain reaction: late prayers, early closures, disputes over prayer timings, and more practically, the city's civic operations, from tax collections to court hearings, depended on this timing. The climate posed challenges. In summer, evaporation made water clocks slightly faster. In winter, the thicker water moved more slowly. Harun kept seasonal logs to compensate, adjusting for humidity, heat, even the kind of clay used in the basin. Some days, the bowls had to be reweighed with a tiny pebble or sealed with a fresh wax patch. To to adjust for flow inconsistencies. Sometimes a visitor would ask, why not just use the sun? But Haroun would smile. The sun, he knew, hid behind clouds. Water was dependable. At midday, Haroun ate a small lunch flatbread, goat cheese, and perhaps a sweet preserved fig. His back ached. His fingers were always wrinkled from water. His notes, tiny time logs written in reed ink on worn parchment, were damp and smudged. But they were his life's record. And still, the clock dripped. This quiet form of labor had a dignity all its own. Timekeeping was seen as a sacred responsibility. In the Islamic world, aligned with the precision of celestial observation and divine order. Haroun may have lived simply, but his work was honored, especially by scholars and judges who relied on his marks to set legal deadlines or establish court records. He sometimes visited the astronomers at the observatory, who watched the stars and calculated planetary movements using instruments far more elegant than his dripping bowls. But even they admitted when clouds rolled in or sandstorms covered the sky, Haroun's little clock ruled the day. At sunset, the final bowl sank into the basin. Haroun dried it gently with a cloth embroidered by his sister, then poured the remaining water into the garden well. His job for the day was done. And as the city lights dimmed and the mosque minarets glowed with torchlight, he would sit beside his clock and wonder if time could be measured by water. Could it also be forgotten by water? By the second decade of Haroun's service, the city of Shiraz had grown not just in population, but in noise. Merchants from India, Arabia, and the Turkic steppes crowded its markets, and philosophers gathered in courtyards to debate logic over sherbet. Minarets grew taller, porticos grander, but the steady rhythm of the water clock remained unchanged, timing every motion behind the curtain of empire. You might think a job as humble as water clock keeping would float beneath the political radar, but it didn't. In fact, Haroun's bowls were at the heart of several arguments among judges, officials, and even rival scholars, because time measured and declared wasn't just about prayer schedules. It was about control. Take, for instance, the Zawal, the noon moment when the sun reaches its highest point. It mattered enormously in the Islamic world. It determined the start of the second prayer of the day, Zuhr. Haroun's timing was supposed to align with the readings of the astronomers and the verdicts of the legal scholars. But some years disagreements flared. One year, a particularly assertive jurist from the Eastern Quarter insisted Haroun's clock was behind by 3 breaths. He demanded an audit. A team of city administrators and a few self-important clerks marched into Haroun's scriptorium, where bowls floated as usual. Water dripped, and Haroun politely but tiredly offered them tea. They watched, they measured, they waited. After an entire day, their conclusion? Haroun was within acceptable drift, though a margin of error was noted. The bowl had taken an extra 7 seconds to sink. Haroun explained calmly that this was due to cooler than average air and a recent change in clay porosity. The inspector, scribbling furiously, seemed unimpressed. Or still, no penalties were given. Timekeepers, even when mildly incorrect, were difficult to replace. But the tension highlighted a larger truth. The more centralized and bureaucratic the city became, the more people cared about precise time. And as they cared more, Haroun found himself increasingly burdened with expectations far beyond the simplicity of his bowls. Judges began using water clock logs to timestamp legal documents. Shop owners appealed to Haroun when accused of keeping stalls open too late. One notable case involved a butcher claiming he closed before the 3rd bowl sank, only to be challenged by a neighbor who timed his departure. The resulting argument escalated into a formal hearing in the mosque courtyard. With Haroun called as a witness, he arrived with his logbook, recited the bowl timings, and added a quiet reminder that timing disputes might be resolved more quickly if his station weren't so often disturbed. Meanwhile, other cities were experimenting with more complex water clocks. Engineers in Baghdad and Isfahan designed elaborate machines, rotating dials, miniature boats that floated from chamber to chamber, even automata that struck bells at set intervals. These devices, inspired by ancient Greek mechanics, and enriched by Islamic mathematical advances, dazzled visitors, but they were costly, fragile, and prone to rust or blockage. Harun heard rumors that a clock in Damascus had broken and flooded the governor's study. His own setup, though modest, rarely failed. A basin, a bowl, a drip. Time did not need embellishment. He believed, only attention. Still, ambition crept in through the city gates. A young engineer, recently appointed by the court, visited Harun's chamber one afternoon, arms full of drawings and ideas. He spoke excitedly of weighted pulleys and mirrored sundials. He proposed replacing the bowl system with a gear-driven contraption. Harun listened, then gently pointed out that the water in Shiraz tended to carry fine silt. It would clog the gear channels. Within a month, the young man left, undeterred, murmuring about springs and filtering devices. Harun, ever patient, poured another bowl, but the encounter left him thoughtful. He knew progress could not be stopped. His method, while elegant in its simplicity, would one day be seen as outdated, perhaps even forgotten. His logs, carefully scribed with the same reed pen for decades, might crumble in a storeroom or be swept away by a future janitor with no knowledge of the hours they once governed. Still, he continued. He adjusted for weather, consulted with scholars, and soothed irate merchants. He taught to apprentices not to innovate, but to listen, to the bowl, to the water, to the stillness. At night, in the last light of the moon, Harun sometimes lay awake and asked himself, was he a servant of time or merely a witness to it? Years passed in slow ripples. The sounds of Shiraz changed: less camel bells, more market chatter, more distant echoes of boots in foreign accents. Yet Harun's basin stayed the same, and the bowls continued their gentle work. Every drop that sank a vessel echoed not just in water, but in memory. As the Buyid dynasty gave way to the Seljuks, and as new rulers came and went with sweeping proclamations, the office of the Mirabiab endured, though sometimes renamed, sometimes neglected, and increasingly misunderstood. The science of timekeeping was evolving. In Isfahan, mechanical clocks began to tick with weights and wheels. In Cairo, Muwakkat's timekeepers trained in astronomy charted stars with delicate instruments. The great observatory at Moraga had been built. Even in distant Andalusia, clocks now marked time with bells, not bowls. And yet Harun, older now, still awoke before sunrise and lit his familiar candle. His knees protested. His fingers curled stiffly round the ladle, but his attention was unwavering. His apprentices had grown into steady men, respectful, careful, but increasingly distracted by dreams of design. They admired the bowl method, yes, but drew blueprints at night for elaborate devices they hoped might win favor in the palace. Harun encouraged their curiosity, though he often reminded them there is beauty in knowing one thing very well. One evening, while mending a fine crack in one of the original bowls, Harun realized he had been keeping time for nearly 40 years. His logbooks now filled a wooden chest. His ink-stained sleeves had faded to a soft brown, and the silence of the scriptorium had become more comforting than words. But changes were coming. Fast. An imperial edict arrived that year. A new governor had ordered the centralization of timekeeping to the court's astronomers. Mechanical devices shall be constructed for the regulation of civic and legal schedules, it read. Water-based systems may be maintained only for ceremonial or scholarly purposes. In short, Harun's bowls were to be retired. He did not protest. There was no rebellion in him, only ritual. For several weeks, the bowls remained still, unused. His apprentices, though apologetic, had been summoned to assist in calibrating the court's new gear-based device. Harun stayed behind, watching sunlight dapple the basin with quiet familiarity. One morning, with no fanfare, he gathered his tools, wiped each bowl with a soft cloth, and placed them gently in a carved cedar box. On a slip of parchment, he wrote, "Let these hold silence until silence is needed again." Then he walked the long path through the city, past the mosque where he once sounded the time, past the baker who always offered him the first loaf, and past the shop where sundials now hung on strings like forgotten toys. He placed the box in the corner of the madrasa's library, under a shelf of astronomy texts, and bowed slightly. He never took another post. No monument marked the retirement of the last great water clock keeper. Of Shiraz, no poem praised the patience of his labor, but the city remembered, in its own quiet way. A fountain in the central garden still flowed with perfect rhythm, said to be calibrated long ago by Harun himself. And in the dusty pages of an old astronomical journal, a line appears barely legible, ink faded by time, though the stars may rule the heavens. The water rules the hours. Harun lived out his final years in peace, his hearing fading, but his sense of rhythm never lost. Sometimes he would walk the gardens and whisper to himself the intervals of the old bowls. His feet would move unconsciously, pacing to the rhythm of the drop, the rise, the silent bell of a well-kept hour. And perhaps in that final, wordless meditation, he understood what few ever do, that keeping time is not about controlling it, but respecting its passing. Story 5. Papyrus and Postman. The postal system of ancient Egypt. Long before pigeons were trained, before pony express routes galloped across empires, and centuries before couriers wore satchels with digital scanners, there were Egyptian messengers, quiet men with sand-crusted sandals and scrolls tucked inside linen sashes, walking the narrow, sun-baked trails of the Nile Valley. They were not called postmen, not exactly. In ancient Egypt, particularly during the New Kingdom period c. 1550 to 1070 BCE, these couriers were part of a royal communication network, functioning somewhere between a mail carrier, a royal servant, and a civil recorder, and they were essential to keeping one of the most sophisticated civilizations of the ancient world running smoothly. By the late period of Egyptian history c. 664 to 330 to BCE, the postal system had begun to morph. More roads had been paved for chariots and administrative use, and messaging grew increasingly complex. Under foreign influence, first the Libyans, then Persians, and eventually Greeks. Each brought new layers of bureaucracy and messaging customs, but they still relied, fundamentally, on the ancient habit of handing a scroll to a human being and trusting him to carry it where it must go. For the couriers themselves, however, the job had changed little. Their feet still blistered, their cloaks still gathered desert dust, and their names were still left off the scrolls they delivered. Even in periods of foreign occupation, Egypt's mail continued recorded on ostraca, etched onto temple walls, preserved in forgotten jars buried in the sand. Some of these scraps, found centuries later by archaeologists, preserve the tone and rhythm of a people dependent on the quiet work of foot messengers. Send the barley before the moon waxes again. The goat died. No more milk. Send word if another is granted. You have not answered. Are you still living? These were not grand declarations of war or religion, but the simple, urgent requests of daily life, and they were trusted to people like Neferu. We don't know what became of him or the thousands like him. No tomb statue commemorates Egypt's couriers. No inscription tells us their daily routes or the distances they covered, but their footprints remain pressed invisibly into the earth between Nile towns, beneath temple courtyards, and along the now dry roads outside Luxor and Memphis. A letter without a sender is frustrating. A letter without a carrier, useless. By the time of the Roman occupation, the Egyptian postal system had been absorbed into the imperial network. Horses replaced runners. Military couriers took precedence. Messages moved faster but also lost something. The handwritten scrolls gave way to dictated documents. Seals became more formal. Couriers were no longer quiet messengers, but instruments of state power. The personal, local intimacy of men like Neferu, who knew the names of temple scribes and the best wells to draw from, faded. Still, every so often, a papyrus fragment turns up, its writing faded but legible. And in the margin, a curious notation, a smudge, a thumbprint, a personal note meant for no one but the courier himself. Delivered by foot, no rest taken. Returned without answer. Waited 3 nights. These, perhaps more than anything, are the voices of the messengers who bound ancient Egypt together. Silent workers, human threads between gods and grain, palace and peasant. So now, as we read their letters in glass cases, in climate-controlled museums far from the Nile, it's worth asking, what do we owe to those who carried the past, one scroll at a time? Story 6. Salt, soap, and spice. The trade staples of the Mali Empire in the 14th century, when most of Europe still staggered beneath feudal lords and muddy roads. West Africa pulsed with caravans, ledgers, and the rhythmic groan of pack saddles, stretching across sun-blanched savannas and golden deserts. The Mali Empire stood not just as a land of kings and warriors but as a land built quietly, persistently, and quite profitably on trade. And not only gold. Gold gets the glory. Mansa Musa, the richest man in recorded history, made headlines across the medieval world with his generous gold-laden pilgrimage to Mecca. But what held the empire together wasn't merely gold, it was the things that moved alongside it. Salt, soap, spices, and the quiet traders and record keepers who counted every block, weighed every bag, and ensured that the marketplace didn't collapse into chaos. Let us follow such a person. A man named Issa, a caravan tallyman working under the court merchant of Walata. Not a merchant himself, not a noble, but a man whose job was as vital as any sword in the empire. Each morning, Issa rose before the sun touched the dunes. His work began with numbers, not in books, but in the grooves of his counting board, an oiled wooden tray with pebbles, ivory counters, and camel bone markers representing goods. By memory, he tracked outgoing bundles of shea butter soap wrapped in palm fibers, the weight of salt slabs from Tagaza, the fragrant bundles of dried ginger and tamarind bark. His caravan was modest today, only 60 camels, 3 donkeys, and a pair of stubborn goats meant for milk. They carried goods bound for Jen, one of the Mali Empire's vibrant trade hubs, where the river met the markets and gossip traveled faster than any drumbeat. Salt was the backbone of the load, not the fine, flaky kind found on tables today, but thick slabs cut from desert mines, pale gray, each the size of a small door tile. Wrapped in leather or cloth, they clinked together softly with each sway of the camel. Salt was not just seasoning, it was currency. It preserved food, softened leather, and was even rubbed into the skin before long journeys. People in the southern parts of the empire, where the air clung damp and thick, would trade nearly a pound of gold for a pound of salt in some years. It sounds unbelievable now, but to live without salt in the Saal was to risk illness, rot, and ruin. Soap came next, dense, fragrant bricks made of shea butter and ash, molded by the women of the village and hardened under straw matting. Not luxury, necessity. For travelers, soap was both comfort and protection, used to cleanse wounds, treat skin infections, or bargain for water rights at oases. Then the spices: ginger, cloves, bitter kola nuts, and the rare grains of paradise, a peppery seed that fetched generous rates in distant markets. Issa was not in charge of selling. His job was to keep track of what left and what returned, and to ensure no one quietly removed a bundle in the middle of the night. The caravan moved slowly, camels plodding across hardened routes etched into the desert by centuries of traders. These were not random paths. They were engineered, maintained by desert guilds who knew the placement of every well, every shade grove, every sandstorm shelter. By mid-morning, the sun scorched without apology. Issa's head wrap dyed with local indigo shielded his skin. He chewed on a lump of dried tamarind to stay hydrated, and passed time rearranging pebbles on his board. He had no map, he had no compass, but he had stories passed from caravan master to apprentice, etched in memory like grooves on a drum. One such story, a salt trader who tried to water down soap to increase profits. His camels, so the tale goes, began refusing to walk, stopping dead in the desert and groaning so loudly that passing Tuaregs assumed the caravan was cursed. Such stories, while exaggerated, carried moral lessons. Trade required trust. The desert punished cheats, not with fines, but with misdirection. Get lost once, and even 1,000 pounds of gold couldn't buy your way out. Issa reached the halfway well by dusk. A ring of acacia trees marked the resting station, and the air was thick with camel sweat, incense smoke, and laughter. Other caravans had arrived, traders from the Songhai to the east, and even a curious party from beyond the Senegal River with cloth dyed in unfamiliar hues. They shared stew, traded jokes, compared weather notes, and above all, they asked, "What are they paying for salt and Jen this week?" Issa took out his counters and began again, carefully recording who gave what, who owed whom, and how many slabs had cracked under heat and careless tying. He wouldn't sell a thing, but when the caravan reached the market, his records would ensure that every merchant received their proper share. Trust, after all, wasn't a handshake hit, was a tally dot as night settled. Issa stared up at the stars, the same ones his grandfather followed, the same ones that marked the routes from Timbuktu to Gao to Jen and back again. He listened to the snores of the camels and the faint notes of a flute drifting from a nearby fire, and he wondered, in that cool desert silence, how many empires had come and gone, unnoticed by the salt and soap they once carried. By the time the caravan reached Jen, the camels were dusted white with salt, and the traders bronzed deep by the Saharan sun. The city, perched along the river Bani, was an oasis of voices, flutes echoing from flat rooftops, spices burning in clay ovens, and wheels creaking under wooden carts filled with rice, bundles of cloth, and jars of honey dark oil. For Issa, rival didn't mean rest. It meant accounting. His job began before the first camel kneeled. Using his tray and polished counters, he verified the inventory. One cracked salt slab was documented and set aside. 2 bundles of shea soap had lost weight due to drying. He adjusted the counts accordingly. The ginger, however, had held up remarkably well. It always did. Jen's market square was more than a place of sale. It was a matrix of obligations. Tanners, blacksmiths, scribes, food sellers, priests, and caravan leaders, everyone moved in patterns honed by generations. The market had no formal supervisor, but it had something better: collective memory. Each trader remembered prices from seasons past, and each tallyman like Issa brought records not just of goods, but of debts, promises, and deliveries long overdue. The salt slabs were first to go. Within an hour, a bricklayer traded 3 for a cart of river clay. A cattle herder swapped 4 for a pair of sturdy goats. Issa logged each transaction on a palm fiber slip, later to be transcribed into a leather-bound ledger by a professional. Scribe. There were no coins exchanged here. Currency, as understood in distant lands, was only one layer of value. In Jen, a transaction could be weighted by salt, gold dust, service, memory, or simply reputation. A man who cheated once would find his goods unsellable the next week, no matter how fine his spices smelled. Issa knew this rhythm well. He even mediated an argument that day between a trader from Timbuktu and a local shopkeeper over whether one soap brick had been partially used. He examined it closely, then nodded. Slightly rounded edges, exposed to moisture, still usable. Adjust the trade by a half measure of millet. They agreed. For goods that didn't sell outright like cola nuts or unripe tamarind pods, Issa marked them under reserve and negotiated storage in a shaded warehouse behind the mosque. The keeper, a heavy-set woman named Fatimata, had watched over caravan goods for decades. Her family's warehouse was better protected than most banks. She and Issa had an arrangement: a bundle of dried fish in exchange for safe space for his soap. At dusk, Issa walked the rows of clay shops. Children played with dolls made from corn husks, and old griots sang under a fig tree, recounting the journeys of Mansa Abu Bakr II, who sailed west and never returned. Above the rooftops, the great mud mosque stood watch, its facade a smooth ripple of baked earth and bundled logs, always under repair, always present. As the sun slipped behind the river's edge, Issa sat to review his numbers by lamplight. The market's energy faded slowly, like heat bleeding from stones. Traders packed up. Scribes checked logs. Drummers beat slow rhythms to mark the close of day. A wandering scholar passed by, noticed Issa's tray, and asked how long he'd been tallying goods. "Since I was tall enough to ride a donkey without falling off," Issa replied. The scholar smiled. "And how many mistakes have you made?" Issa looked at his stones. "None I didn't correct before the next moon." That was the ethic of his craft, not perfection, but vigilance. You didn't need to be fast. You didn't need to be clever. You needed to remember every soap brick, every salt slab, every trader's promise from a season ago. Trade was not just about goods moving. It was about people staying accountable. And yet, as the city lights dimmed and Issa marked the last measure of ginger into his record, he couldn't help but wonder, what would happen if these rhythms broke, if the counters stopped clicking? The ledgers stopped being kept. Would trust alone be enough to carry an empire? Morning in Jen began with bird calls and the soft clinking of iron pots. But for Issa, it began with packing. His work here was nearly done. The traders had been paid, the goods recorded, and the market cycle complete. Now came the quiet part, preparing for the journey home, and wondering what legacy had been left behind besides neat bundles and scribbled receipts. The Mali Empire, at its height, spanned thousands of miles. From the Atlantic coast to the edge of Lake Chad, it was not just a land of kings and mosques, but of movement, and that movement depended on trade. Not conquest, not crusades, not monuments carved in stone, but the mundane, salt carried by camels, soap bartered for fish, spice used in stew and ceremony alike. Issa was one of the invisible hands that kept this rhythm steady. As he checked his tray of markers one last time, a younger tallyman named Jabari approached. He had questions eager, hungry ones. How do you track perishable goods? How do you log a barter with multiple layers? What do you do when two salt traders offer different slabs at the same value? Issa answered with patience. He explained the balance between recording what was fair and honoring what was agreed. You are not here to judge the weight of salt, he said. You are here to weigh the trust between people. And with that, he passed Jabari his oldest marker, a polished pebble worn smooth. By years of use, it remembers more trade than both of us. The return journey would be quieter. Fewer goods, fewer stops. The camels trotted at ease, unburdened by heavy loads. The desert stretched wide and endless. But as his thoughts were busy, he remembered, years earlier, the salt riots in a village near Niani. A poor harvest had caused prices to spike. Fights broke out. Traders fled. It was the tallyman who restored order, not with guards, but with ledgers. Issa and his peers gathered old records, showed the fair prices from previous years, and helped distribute stores according to need. It wasn't dramatic, but it worked. Issa also thought of the letters, those tied in goat leather, carried between cities with news of deaths, births, marriages, or shifts in the throne. Tallymen sometimes acted as scribes when no one else could write. He had written letters to a distant wife for a grieving herder once. Another time, he carried a child's drawing to an uncle in Timbuktu. Trade wasn't just about wealth. It was about connection. But now, things were changing. More routes were being claimed by rival groups. The empire's reach was stretching thin. New traders spoke unfamiliar dialects. Gold was moving through ports farther south. And in the distance, foreign ships were seen on the horizon. Issa didn't fear change, but he wondered, would the new ways honor the old trust? Would ledgers be replaced by scales? Would counters be replaced by coins by the time the caravan returned to Walata? Issa's records were passed on to the palace merchants. He had logged every trade, every exchange, every agreed-upon return. His job was complete. He was offered a new post overseer of ledgers for the northern routes, but Issa declined. He'd heard enough camel bells. He wanted quiet now, not silence, exactly. Just stillness. He kept his tray of counters, not out of nostalgia, but because numbers to him were like stories. Each stone, each mark, told of people who trusted each other across long roads and shifting sands. Years later, a flood would wash through Jen's market, and many of the older ledgers would be lost. Some claimed Issa's tray survived wrapped in cloth, hidden in the rafters of a house near the mosque. Others say it was buried beside him, placed on his chest like a medal. But none of the legends really matter. What mattered was that Issa, like so many forgotten record keepers of the past, left behind no songs or statues, just the quiet assurance that, for a time, the world was balanced. Salt was traded fairly, soap arrived where it was needed, and an empire flowed smoothly because one man kept count. And perhaps that's the heart of it. The smallest things, counted carefully, are what make the biggest things last. Let us follow one such man, Nefuru, a fictional, composite character drawn from real administrative records, ostraka, inscribed pottery shards, and surviving letters etched into flaking papyrus. He works under the vizier's office in Thebes, assigned to the Department of Correspondence. Each morning begins not with roosters, but with reed pens scratching across clay tablets. A scribe, seated cross-legged on a woven mat, dictates messages addressed to nomes, provinces, granary stewards, or tax officials. The handwriting is precise. Hierarchical cursive, a script called hieratic used for daily business. The papyrus is coarse and handmade. Its smell earthy and dry. Once a scroll is completed, it is rolled tightly, tied with flax twine, and sealed with a blob of mud bearing the stamp of the writer. This isn't for decoration, it proves authenticity. A broken seal means a letter has been tampered with. Nefru steps forward, dressed in a plain white linen kilt, a short tunic, and sandals stiffened by dessert dust. He receives the scroll, nods, and tucks it carefully into a narrow leather pouch bound to his waist. His route today is not far, only to a no-marches office north of Karnak. But the journey must be swift, and the timing precise. Egypt's postal system didn't operate on fixed schedules like today's mail. Instead, it moved according to need, when royal orders were issued, when land surveys were completed, or when temples requested new inventories. The network relied on human memory, reputation, and efficiency, and perhaps more importantly on endurance. Nefru sets out, hugging the edge of the canal. He walks fast, not sprinting, but with the trained pace of someone who knows the desert sun waits for no man. The reed-filled landscape hums with dragonflies and the soft gurgle of irrigation. Channels. He is not alone. Other couriers pass him, go in the opposite direction, some carrying grain tallies, others tax receipts or orders from the high priest of Ammon. They nod politely, but rarely stop to talk. Every courier has his own rhythm, and the letters must move. There are resting stations along the way, modest huts maintained by the administration, offering shade, dates, and a pot of cool water. Nefru knows them all. The one near the sycamore grove keeps better water. The one by the stonemason's yard usually has sweetened bread if you ask nicely. The job might sound routine, but it is also dangerous. Bandits sometimes stalk the outer paths, hoping to intercept scrolls for bribes or blackmail. Wild animals, jackals, snakes pose a different threat. And yet, perhaps the greatest hazard is the scroll itself. Because in Egypt, writing carried power. Words were not just information, they were imbued with sacred essence. A letter from a temple, once opened, had to be read aloud by an official scribe to ensure the proper phrasing and ritual format. Even private letters between nobles followed. Etiquette so rigid that scribes often wrote drafts and practiced signatures on scrap pieces of limestone before finalizing the papyrus. And Nefru knew better than to read what he carried. Couriers who read official letters without permission, if caught, were punished with fines, lashes, or removal from service. Still, he sometimes wondered what stories passed through his hands. Did the scroll in his pouch today command a tax, audit, a blessing, a warning? He reached the district office by early afternoon. The no-marches assistant, a lean man with coal-lined eyes, inspected the seal, sniffed the scroll as if verifying its freshness, then broke the clay with a thin reed. Without a word, Nefru turned to leave. He would carry a reply back tomorrow if one was needed. For now, he would spend the evening at the rest station, sipping beer made from barley mash and listening to the frogs croaking from the canal. In the fading heat, he wiped the dust from his arms and rested his feet on a sun-warmed stone dot. In the records of Egypt, no statue was carved for a courier like Nefru. But without him, Pharaoh's words would never reach the fields, and temple inventories would collapse into chaos. And as he lay under a roof of reeds, watching stars emerge one by one over the quiet river, perhaps he wondered, did the gods, who watched all things, also watch the ones who delivered the messages? As the Nile swelled and receded in its patient, seasonal rhythm, so too did the correspondence networks of ancient Egypt swell with scribbled messages and royal decrees. These letters weren't merely exchanges of polite words, they were the connective tissue of empire. Without them, grain wouldn't move, temples wouldn't receive incense, and tomb workers might forget who to worship on which festival day. After a night under the thatched roof of the rest station, Nefru rises. With the dawn, he eats a simple meal, bread dipped in honey if he's lucky, or more often, dates and water, and checks the satchel that will once again carry instructions across Egypt's long, sunlit corridors. Today's message, sealed with the cartouche of a minor priest, is destined for a temple warehouse. A shipment of myrrh has gone missing, and someone in Thebes wants answers. But unlike the efficient image we might have of state mail, Egypt's system was less a fixed chain and more a web flexible, local, and ever-shifting. Messages were routed through scribal centers at temples, estate offices, military outposts, and even tomb worker villages, like the now famous Deir el-Medina. In fact, places like Deir el-Medina were some of the most well-documented letter hubs. In Egypt, home to the artisans who carved and painted the Valley of the Kings, the village operated under strict royal supervision. Every tool, every chisel, every ration of bread and beer had to be logged and delivered, often accompanied by a letter or receipt, and often on foot. The letters they sent and received weren't only bureaucratic. We know of letters scrawled by workers to their wives during festival absences, letters asking for more oil, for the return of borrowed sandals, or even to accuse neighbors of stealing laundry. And each of these letters, no matter how petty, was entrusted to someone like Neferu. Of course, the courier's role varied by the importance of the message. A dispatch from the pharaoh's court might travel by chariot under armed guard, but most messages were simply carried in the folds of linen, tucked behind the chest, protected with a simple waxed wrap in case of rain. Though the Egyptian climate, to its credit, was rarely wet, when Neferu arrived at the temple warehouse, a different routine began. Unlike the government offices with their stern silence, the temple courtyards buzzed with activity, scribes cataloging incense bundles, guards checking delivery carts, and storekeepers shouting about spoiled dates or broken amphorae. He presented the sealed letter to a woman named Satzobek, a senior scribe, with calloused hands and a voice that cut through market noise. She inspected the seal, sniffed the papyrus as was custom, and gestured him to sit. He would wait for a response. Waiting was part of the job. Couriers often sat in shaded corners of courtyards, watching cats chase flies and goats nibble on papyrus scraps, while scribes debated the proper phrasing of a reply. Every letter required careful wording, not too humble, not too proud. And all this time, the courier waited still, silent, and often unnoticed. When the response was finally handed to him, dried, sealed, and marked, Neferu tucked it safely into his pouch. His sandals, worn smooth by years of walking, found the path again with automatic familiarity, north this time, following the Nile's bend. We rarely think of infrastructure in ancient civilizations, but Egypt, more than many of its contemporaries, understood its importance. Dikes, granaries, canals, and yes, messages moved in regulated cycles. The empire did not rely solely on glory or gold, but on timely information. Even international diplomacy moved through couriers. Clay tablets found at Amarna contain letters from the kings of Babylonia, Assyria, and Hatti addressed to the pharaoh and carried across deserts by messengers, trusted to ride for weeks. These were not just envoys, they were human threads tying kingdoms together. Back on the road, Neferu adjusted his satchel, his feet sore, his mind tracing the turns ahead. A village in the distance, a bakery that sometimes offered sour pomegranate beer, and always the papyrus tucked securely by his side, fragile, flammable, but binding. Sometimes he paused beneath palm trees, not for rest, but to review the scribbled markings on a discarded astrakhan. Even couriers could learn to read, slowly. Over years of quiet observation, he wouldn't admit it aloud, but when no one watched, he traced the curves of a familiar phrase, "May the gods protect this house and the bearer of news." And as he walked onward into the heat shimmer, he wondered who would carry messages when all the scrolls turned to dust. By the time Neferu's legs grew slow and his sandals frayed into papery strips, he had walked more of Egypt than most men would see in a lifetime. Not in search of wealth or adventure, but for something far more understated: communication. The transmission of words, orders, names, dates, blessings, warnings, thanks, messages so seemingly small they barely made a sound, yet without them, the empire would fall silent. He'd seen seasons come and go, temples refurbished and left to crumble, rulers replaced and remembered only in the changing symbols of their cartouches. But the scrolls kept coming. As long as people needed news delivered, there was work for men like Neferu. But time changes everything, even the timeless. Sands of the Nile.